You were not born hating yourself. That is the truth no one told you. The feeling of inadequacy that follows you like a shadow, that silent sense that you are wrong, broken, unworthy of love, did not come from within you. It was taught. It was inherited. You did not come into the world with shame. It was placed in you like an invisible poison, distilled drop by drop through looks, words, and silences. And today, perhaps you are living an entire life based on a lie about who you really are. This lie has a name: shame. Not the healthy shame that protects us from overstepping others' boundaries, but toxic shame, the kind that tells you the problem is not what you did, but who you are. That your very existence is a flaw, a problem to be hidden. And to endure this, you learned to disguise yourself. You created versions of yourself to please, to protect, to belong. But the more you perform, the further you get from your essence. Nietzsche understood this with cruel clarity. For him, shame is a moral invention, a tool used by religions and social systems to suppress instincts, control bodies, and impose values that deny life. Shame serves a purpose: to domesticate you, to make you walk with your head down, to turn your yes to life into a timid whisper. But Nietzsche did not want you to free yourself to live a correct life. He wanted you to be free to create new values, to say yes to yourself with aesthetic courage, to be reborn as a free spirit after destroying the false gods that shaped you. Bradshaw, decades later, gives a clinical name to the same suffering: toxic shame. He shows how this feeling, when internalized in childhood, completely distorts self-image. The child learns that they are not loved as they are and creates a false self to survive. But this false self comes at a high price. It protects you, but it also traps you. And what is at stake here is not just mental health. It is your identity. It is your ability to feel whole. This video is not a consolation. It is a confrontation, a direct call to those who are tired of pretending, of molding themselves, of hiding. Here, we will expose the roots of this shame that binds you, demolish the pillars that support this false self, and, more importantly, show that there is a way back, a path of healing, reconnection, and reconstruction. But I warn you, this path requires courage. The courage to look at yourself without filters, to admit the pain, to abandon the patterns that keep you accepted but empty. Because only when you face shame head-on does it begin to lose its power. And perhaps, for the first time, you will start to remember who you truly are. And that changes everything. Shame is not just a feeling. It is a project. A mechanism carefully crafted over centuries to shape bodies, silence voices, and imprison minds. The society you live in, from the religion you heard in childhood to the aesthetic standards that bombard you on social media, was built on the idea that you need to correct yourself all the time, that you are, by nature, a walking mistake, and that you will only be worthy of acceptance if you deny your deepest impulses. Nietzsche saw this with disconcerting clarity. For him, traditional morality, especially Christian morality, did not arise from an ideal of goodness, but from resentment, from the weak who could not act but could judge. He called this the slave morality, a system built to invert the values of life and glorify renunciation, sacrifice, and obedience. Instinct, power, desire, everything that pulses and vibrates within you came to be considered dirty, sinful, shameful. And the more you believed in this, the more easily you became controllable. This systematic repression of vital impulses creates an abyss between who you are and what you are told you should be. And this abyss is called shame. A shame that makes you lower your eyes, apologize for existing, Seek approval all the time, even if it means betraying yourself. Nietzsche did not want you to be good. He wanted you to be whole, to affirm life in all its intensity, with lights and shadows, with mistakes and desires, with chaos and beauty. But how to affirm life if all we were taught was to fear it? Shame is the castration of existence. It is the denial of your creative power. And the more you try to fit into imposed standards, whether of spiritual purity, aesthetic perfection, or social success, the further you get from your truth. Moral repression not only crushes authenticity, it transforms it into guilt, and you begin to carry a cross that isn't even yours. As Nietzsche said, the values we worship today were forged in resentment, in denial of life, and that is why we always feel indebted, even when we have done nothing wrong. This eternal debt, which can never be settled, is the fuel of shame. And it begins long before adulthood. It starts when a child hears that they are misbehaving, that they need to behave, that good boys don't do that. It starts when a natural impulse is punished with rejection, when desire becomes sin, when crying is ridiculed. This is the moment when the being begins to divide. And instead of developing autonomy, they learn to monitor themselves, to censor themselves, to hate themselves. This shame then ceases to be an episode and becomes an identity. It does not just say, "You did something wrong." It says, "You are wrong." And from there, moral repression internalizes. You become your own executioner. But here is the brutal truth. All this guilt, all this weight, has nothing divine about it. They were created to bend you. And only when you recognize this does the possibility of liberation begin. But this liberation does not happen merely through a rational decision. Because even after you understand that shame was imposed, it still lives within you, camouflaged in habits, beliefs, and internal voices that you have learned to call I. And this is where another layer of the problem comes in, the false self, the persona you constructed to survive shame, the mask you wear to be accepted. This is what we will talk about now. Get ready. The next part reveals how this toxic shame seeps into the depths of the psyche and steals your identity. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. Have you ever caught yourself smiling while everything inside you was screaming? Have you ever pretended to be okay to avoid bothering others, to not weigh down the atmosphere? This daily performance, this disconnection between what you feel and what you show, is not just a matter of politeness or civility. It is survival. And according to John Bradshaw, it is the most evident symptom of something much deeper. The false self created to cover up toxic shame. Bradshaw defines toxic shame as a pathological transformation of a natural emotion into a state of being. It is no longer just a feeling that appears at specific moments, like when you make a mistake. It becomes the lens through which you see yourself all the time. You do not feel shame. You are shameful. This distorted, internalized, and constant perception generates a collapse of identity. And the result is devastating. You need to stop being yourself to continue existing. The child who grows up under judgmental gazes, constant criticism, or emotional abandonment begins to conclude that there is something intrinsically wrong with them. They do not understand that the adults around them are wounded, limited, or absent. They just feel, if they do not see me, it is because I am invisible. If they reject me, it is because I am rejectable. And thus begins the construction of an internal prison. The true self, spontaneous, sensitive, imperfect, is sealed in the basement of the psyche. And in its place, the false self is born. This false self is an armor. It learns to smile to be accepted, to be silent to avoid conflict, to be useful to avoid abandonment. It molds itself to the expectations of the environment like a psychic chameleon, ready to erase any trace of authenticity that might be considered too much, too sensitive, too emotional, too bold. And this adaptation is so effective that over time, you forget you are wearing a mask. You believe the mask is you, but the truth is that the false self is never enough. It can be functional, even socially admired, but it is always exhausted, anxious, disconnected. Because maintaining this performance requires a brutal effort. You have to monitor emotions, recalculate words, contain gestures, anticipate rejections. Toxic shame makes the simple act of existing a minefield. And living like this, day after day, is a slow way to extinguish yourself. Bradshaw describes this process as a form of silent psychological violence. He calls it soul murder, a strong term, but necessary, because over the years, internalized shame kills everything that is vital in you: spontaneity, pleasure, curiosity, self-love. In its place, there remains a hyper-rational subject full of self-censorship, living on autopilot. A ghost that fulfills social functions but has lost the sense of presence, of being, of vibrancy. The problem is that this false self does not disappear with good intentions. It does not dismantle with motivational phrases or self-help posts. It was built as a shield to deal with pain, absence, and fear. Therefore, the first step to healing is to recognize its existence and the reason it emerged. As long as you believe that your true self is defective, you will continue to wear this armor. You will keep living to avoid shame, not to live life. And that is where Bradshaw's ideas meet Nietzsche. Because while we need to heal the emotional wound and rescue the wounded self, we also need to question where the lie that created this wound came from. We need to confront the inherited values that taught us to hate ourselves. And Nietzsche offers us just that. A philosophy of radical deconstruction, of transvaluation, of the rebirth of the free spirit. If the false self is the internal prison, Nietzsche offers the hammer to break the bars. But this process is not just destruction, it is creation. This is what we will talk about next: how the deconstruction of inherited values is not an act of blind rebellion, but of profound, creative freedom. An essential step to stop being the reflection of others' gaze and finally become the author of one's own existence. Imagine someone who spends years building a castle to protect themselves from attacks. Each stone, each wall, is a defense against pain. But over time, what was protection transforms into a prison. The key is lost, and what remains is a human being locked inside themselves, afraid to feel, to err, to be. It is at this breaking point, where psychological suffering meets its existential roots, that the ideas of John Bradshaw and Friedrich Nietzsche converge with a terrifying precision. Although coming from different fields, one a clinical therapist, the other a philosopher of chaos, both diagnose the same ailment: the rupture between the individual and their essence. Toxic shame for Bradshaw is the poison that distorts identity from childhood. For Nietzsche, this shame is the product of a decadent morality created to weaken the vital power of the human being. And the antidote, in both cases, requires courage. A courage that begins with facing the pain. Bradshaw invites us to descend into the catacombs of the psyche, where the wounded child resides. The one who heard they were too much, who was ignored, punished, or silenced. The healing process involves rescuing this child, not to protect them with more masks, but to let them live. To give voice to what has been silenced. To rebuild the bridge between the true self and the world. But he is clear. This hurts. The return to the authentic self requires traversing the desert of internalized shame, self-judgment, and emotional memory. It is a plunge into one's own darkness. Nietzsche, for his part, offers no emotional relief. He is not interested in comforting, but in awakening. For him, shame is a symptom of a culture of denial. Denial of the body, of instincts, of the will to power. Civilization, according to him, was built at the cost of repression, and the consequence of this is nihilism, an existence emptied of meaning, inhabited by domesticated subjects, guilty for existing. Nietzsche demands destruction. He speaks of revaluation of values, of murdering idols, of setting fire to the foundations of inherited moral thought. Because only when everything false is reduced to ashes can something new emerge. And here lies the most fascinating point. Bradshaw speaks of healing, Nietzsche of creation. But both are talking about the same thing. It is not just about eliminating pain, it is about recreating oneself. The reconnection with authentic identity is not merely a process of recovery. It is an act of birth, of reinvention, of radical affirmation of life. Shame, when faced head-on, no longer needs to dictate your identity. It can be the starting point, the portal, the place where the false self begins to dissolve and the true self begins to breathe. Bradshaw offers the emotional tools for this: self-acceptance, reconstruction of the internal image, development of self-compassion. Nietzsche provides the philosophical impetus, the strength to say yes to life, even without guarantees, even in chaos, even without promises of salvation. Liberation requires both movements, the deep dive into trauma and the heroic denial of the values that perpetuate pain. Only then is it possible to free oneself from shame, not just as a feeling, but as a life structure. And this liberation demands a radical act, to kill the idols you carry within yourself. That is what we will do next. We will break the internal altars of guilt, obedience, and perfection. We will talk about destruction, but not as an end, rather as preparation for the rebirth of the true self. Are you ready to wield the hammer? You don't feel ashamed by chance. The shame you carry has architects. It was ideas, values, and beliefs that taught you to doubt yourself. It was voices, often disguised as love, that made you believe that the right thing was to shrink, that being modest was nobler than being true, that denying your desires was a sign of purity, that suffering in silence was a virtue. These are the internal gods, false idols that you learn to worship, not by choice, but for survival. Friedrich Nietzsche invites us to a brutal and necessary act, the destruction of these idols. He calls this Umwertung aller Werte, the revaluation of all values. This means questioning everything that has been sold to us as truth. It means understanding that many of the values we internalized as a moral compass were, in fact, forged by forces that wanted submission, not authenticity. And the first step towards this rupture is recognizing that these values still live within you. They are present when you sabotage yourself while trying something new, when you feel guilty for wanting, when you remain silent to avoid displeasing, when you judge yourself for not being good enough. These automatic reactions do not arise from your essence. They are inherited programming. They are the gods that Nietzsche commanded to be killed. Because as long as you do not break these internal altars, you will continue trying to adapt to what hurts you, instead of creating what liberates you. Destroying these idols is not an act of hatred. It is an act of lucidity. It is realizing that many of the commandments that govern your life were based on fear, not on truth. They were built by cultures that demonized the body, pleasure, doubt, error, individuality. Cultures that deified guilt as a tool of control, that used duty as a shackle and sin as a chain. Nietzsche calls this the morality of slaves, a system that glorifies weakness, submission, renunciation, because it fears strength, autonomy, and instinct. When you begin to kill these internal gods, something extraordinary happens. The space that was once occupied by guilt opens up for creation. For the first time, you start to ask yourself, what are my own values? What do I consider beautiful? What do I want to affirm? This is the birth of aesthetic freedom, of existential authorship. It is no longer about following rules, but about writing your own law. Like an artist who transforms pain into work, you begin to transform shame into power. Nietzsche does not ask you to rebel impulsively. He demands that you create with intention, that in destroying the old idols, you do not fall into the void of nihilism but build new meanings, that your life be, in his words, a work of art, that you take the risk of authenticity not as blind revolt but as conscious affirmation. This process is uncomfortable. The pain of disappointing expectations, of breaking with old roles, of being seen as selfish or difficult is part of the price of freedom. But it is a low price compared to the cost of living a life that is not yours. By tearing down these internal gods, you are merely returning to yourself what was stolen from you, the right to exist without apology. But there is an important detail. It is not enough to destroy. The ground now needs to be rebuilt, and it is precisely here that Bradshaw returns with his contribution. Because while Nietzsche shows us how to deconstruct inherited values, Bradshaw shows us how to rebuild the self shattered by shame. It is time to go deeper, not to get lost in trauma, but to rescue the most vital part of who we are, the inner child that was abandoned, silenced, but is still alive. In the next chapter, we will enter this forgotten territory. We will talk about healing, about reunion, about the difficult yet transformative journey of coming home, within yourself. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebook, Beyond the Shadow. It breaks down Jung's core ideas and gives you tools to understand yourself more deeply. Link is in the pinned comment. A wounded soul does not heal with good intentions, nor with ready-made phrases, nor with promises of quick overcoming. The shame that inhabits you is not just an emotion. It is a field of ruins, an entire system of beliefs, memories, silences, and pacts you made with yourself to endure the pain. And to rebuild who you are, you need to return to the point where it all began, the moment you stopped being whole to become acceptable. John Bradshaw guides us with brutal clarity and deep compassion through this crossing. He speaks of the inner child, not as a poetic metaphor, but as a real entity alive within you that continues to wait for recognition. This child was silenced when it expressed too much. It was punished for feeling, ignored for needing, ridiculed for being authentic. And to survive, it learned to hide. It created layers, characters, defenses. But it never ceased to exist. It is there, at the center of your anxiety, in the emptiness after an achievement, in the nameless anger, in the fear of showing yourself. It is the root of everything you feel and everything you try to silence. Healing is going to it, not to judge it, but to listen to it, to allow it to cry what it could never cry, to say that now, finally, someone is willing to protect it, and that someone is you. Bradshaw calls this moment the reintegration of the fragmented self. It is when you stop living from the persona shaped by shame and start living from your essence, even if it is still wounded, even if it still trembles. But this reunion is not linear. It requires confronting the internal voices that repeat tirelessly the old script. You are weak, you are too much, you do not deserve. These voices are not yours. They are echoes. They are internalized programming from authority figures, parents, teachers, leaders, cultures. Bradshaw teaches us to unmask these voices, to replace them with a language of truth and compassion, to gradually develop a new internal narrative, no longer based on the denial of who we are, but on the radical acceptance of our humanity. And it is here that Nietzsche echoes again. To say yes to life, as he proposes, is not to accept only what is beautiful or strong. It is to accept everything, including the pain, including the failure, including the absurd. It is having the courage to look at yourself with all the scars and still affirm, this is also me, and I am no longer ashamed. Because true healing is not the absence of pain, but the presence of self. And this presence is only possible when we stop fleeing from our story. Rescuing the inner child, then, is a political, spiritual, and existential act. It is breaking with the logic of shame that says, you are defective, and replacing it with a much more powerful truth. You are whole, even when you are in pieces. It is abandoning the ideal of perfection and embracing wholeness. It is recognizing that vulnerability is not weakness. It is the foundation of any real form of freedom. But there is something more, because it is not enough to simply rescue this child. It is necessary to give it a new world to live in. A world where it can express itself, create, exist without fear. And this world is born only when you stop molding yourself to the expectations of others and start creating your own values. When the reconstruction of the self is not limited to healing the past, but expands to the conscious creation of the future. And this is precisely what we are going to talk about now. The time has come to unite all these layers, the deep look inward, the deconstruction of inherited values, the healing of the original wound, to achieve what Nietzsche called the free spirit. We will talk about identity not as inheritance or trauma, but as work, as creation, as a radical affirmation of who you choose to be. You spent your life trying to adapt, believing that if you were a little calmer, a little more productive, a little more beautiful, stronger, quieter, more acceptable, everything would be fine. And yet, it wasn't, because the problem was never you. The problem is that you were taught to be ashamed of who you are. You were taught to hide in order to be loved, to mutilate yourself to be accepted, to silence yourself to be tolerated. But the truth is that no love is worth your denial. No acceptance is worth the price of your essence. True freedom begins when you stop trying to correct yourself to fit into the molds of a sick world. When you understand that you are not here to become perfect, but to become real. That your worth does not come from how much you fit in, but from how much you assert yourself. That your body, your voice, your impulses, your story, all of this is a legitimate expression of life, and that living truthfully is more important than pleasing with masks. Nietzsche called this becoming a free spirit, someone who does not bow before idols nor obey out of inertia, a being who creates their own values, not as empty rebellion, but as an aesthetic, philosophical, and existential act. To be free, for Nietzsche, is to say yes to life with all its contradictions. It is to face chaos without needing to pretend it makes sense. It is to affirm yourself even when the whole world says you should hate yourself. Bradshaw translates this into the realm of the psyche. He speaks of reconnecting with the authentic self, breaking free from toxic shame, healing the abandoned self. And this process, although painful, is also liberating, because it is not just about stopping suffering, it is about starting to live fully, to occupy your place in the world without apologizing for it. Yes, it is possible to free yourself from shame. Yes, it is possible to reclaim your identity, but do not wait for permission. No one is going to give you a certificate of authenticity. This permission needs to come from within. It needs to arise from the exhaustion of being what others want, and from the desire to finally be who you are. No longer a character, no longer an armor, but someone present, whole, human, and therefore deeply worthy. And now, I want to invite you to do something simple yet powerful Leave in the comments the phrase, "I free myself from shame." Write it down, name it. Because when you name the prison, you begin the process of getting out of it. And if this message touched something inside you, share it with those who need it. Because there are many people living in shame and thinking that this is normal. And above all, do not stop here. The next video is also essential on this journey. It delves even deeper into the path we are walking together. You deserve to go all the way. Your freedom demands it. See you there.